Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my HOA Karen Tales channel? Thank you so much. Jake Carter had always considered himself a laid-back guy. He wasn't the type to get into neighborhood politics or care about what shade of beige his mailbox was painted. So when he bought a house in Oakage Estates, a pristine HOA control neighborhood, he thought he was just paying for peace and quiet. The place had everything: a beautifully paved road, well-manicured lawns, and houses that all looked as if they belonged on a postcard. He knew there were HOA rules, of course, but how bad could they really be? The answer came in the form of a letter. It arrived just 2 weeks after he moved in, a crisp white envelope stamped with the official seal of the Oak Homeowners Association. He opened it without a second thought, assuming it was some kind of welcome packet. Instead, his eyes locked onto a single ridiculous sentence. You have been fined $50,000 for violating HOA driveway regulations. Jake read it 3 times, sure he was misinterpreting something. $50,000? That was more than he had spent remodeling his entire kitchen. What kind of driveway violation could possibly warrant a fine that outrageous? He walked outside and stared at his driveway, a perfectly normal stretch of smooth concrete. There are no cracks, no graffiti, no broken pieces. It was just a driveway. His confusion quickly turned to annoyance. This had to be some kind of mistake. He wasn't going to panic over a clerical error. He picked up his phone and called the HOA office, expecting a quick resolution. A chirpy voice answered, "Oak Homeowners Association, this is Linda speaking. How may I assist you?" "Yeah, I just got this fine in the mail, $50,000 for my driveway." "That's got to be a mistake, right?" A short pause. "Let me check your account, sir. Can I have your property address?" He gave it to her, tapping his fingers on the counter while she typed. A few seconds later, she exhaled sharply. "Oh no, sir. That is correct." Jake frowned. "What do you mean, correct? What's wrong with my driveway?" "Well," she began in an overly sweet voice, "your driveway does not meet the Oakage aesthetic guidelines. Section 12B of the Community Regulation states that all driveways must be constructed with approved materials, and yours isn't." "I use concrete," Jake said, trying to keep his patience. "Ah, yes," Linda replied, "but it's the wrong shade of concrete." Jake nearly dropped his phone. "The wrong shade?" "Yes, sir. According to the Oakid HOA handbook, all driveways must be in one of 3 approved shades: ash gray, cloud gray, or heather gray. Your driveway is—" She paused, "just gray." "You're joking." "I assure you, sir, we take our regulations very seriously." Jake felt his blood pressure spike. $50,000 for that. The fine is in place to maintain the neighborhood's property values. Jake clenched his jaw. "So what exactly am I supposed to do?" "You'll need to replace your driveway with an approved shade," Linda said, "or pay the fine." He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "I'm not paying 50 grand over the color of my driveway." "Well, sir," she said, her tone shifting. Fake friendliness to a cold sharpness. "Failure to comply will result in additional penalties. If fines are not paid, the HOA has the authority to place a lien on your home and, if necessary, begin full closure proceedings." Jake gritted his teeth. He had heard horror stories about HOAs, but he had never imagined they could actually threaten his house over something so ridiculous. "Who do I talk to about this?" "That would be our HOA president, Karen Whitmore," Linda replied. "She'll be at the board meeting this Friday." Jake hung up and sat down at his kitchen counter, trying to process the insanity of the situation. $50,000 for concrete, the wrong shade of concrete. That Friday, he walked into the HOA meeting determined to set things straight. The room was filled with a dozen board members, all sitting behind a long table. At the center sat Karen Whitmore, an older woman with a sharp haircut and an even sharper expression. She peered at Jake over her glasses like he was a stain on her designer blouse. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "what can we do for you?" Jake held up the letter. "You fine me 50 grand over my driveway? That's insane." Karen gave a slow, deliberate nod. "It's not insane, Mr. Carter. It's policy." "Policy?" "It's robbery," he shot back. "You can't seriously expect me to replace my entire driveway because it's not the right shade of gray." Karen folded her hands neatly. "Mr. Carter, When you purchased your home, you agreed to abide by the HOA's rules. The regulations exist to protect our neighborhood's prestige and property values. This is about power, not prestige. Jake snapped. Karen's expression darkened. You are welcome to file an appeal, but I should warn you, the board has never reversed a fine. If the fee remains unpaid, the association will move forward with legal action. Jake stared at her, realizing she wasn't bluffing. These people weren't just enforcing rules. They were drunk on control. He could fight this, sure, take them to court, argue over the stupidity of it all. But something in Karen's smug expression told him she'd enjoy every minute of making his life miserable. And that's when the idea hit him. They wanted to play dirty? Fine, he'd play too. Karen and her cronies thought they had the upper hand, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. If they wanted his money, they'd have to fight him for it. Because instead of paying that fine, he was about to buy their entire street. Jake sat in his living room, staring at the fine notice still sitting on his kitchen counter. He had read it over a dozen times, but each time it made less sense. $50,000 over the color of his driveway? Not a crack, not a violation of safety, just a different shade of gray. The more he thought about it, the more ridiculous it became. It wasn't just about money, it was about power. Karen and her HOA minions didn't care about rules, they cared about control. They wanted to show him that he had no say, that they ran this neighborhood, and he was just another homeowner who had to obey every demand that wasn't going to happen. If they thought they could bully him, they were in for a surprise. He wasn't just going to fight back. He was going to make sure they regretted ever coming after him. He knew one thing. Every organization had a weak spot, a flaw buried beneath its perfect facade. The HOA wasn't some untouchable force. It was just a bunch of people enforcing rules they thought they had complete control over. If there was a way in, he would find it. He grabbed his laptop and started researching everything he could about HOAs, their authority, their structure, and most importantly, their limitations. He learned that while they could fine homeowners and even place liens on properties, they didn't always own the land everything sat on. In some cases, the roads, the clubhouses, even entire sections of a neighborhood could still be owned by private individuals or developers. If that was true for Oakage Estates, then maybe, just maybe, there was a way to turn the tables. The next morning, Jake reached out to a real estate lawyer, Maggie Reed, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had a reputation for tearing apart HOA contracts. He sat in her office, laying out everything he had uncovered. She listened carefully, taking notes, then leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against her desk. So, you're telling me they fined you $50,000 over a shade of concrete, she said, raising an eyebrow. That's right, Jake said, trying not to sound as frustrated as he felt. Maggie shook her head. I've dealt with a lot of HOA nonsense, but that might be the most absurd case I've ever heard. Tell me there's something I can do, Jake said, something that doesn't involve me paying them a cent. Maggie smirked. Oh, there's always something. The question is, how much do you want to hurt them? Jake didn't hesitate. As much as legally possible. Maggie nodded, flipping through a thick binder filled with legal codes and property records. After a few minutes of searching, she let out a satisfied hum. Well, look at that, she said, sliding a document across the desk. The HOA doesn't own the entire neighborhood. The streets, the clubhouse, and a few key lots are still privately owned. They lease them from a third party. Jake's heart started pounding. Who owns them? Maggie pulled up a name. Frank Holloway. Looks like he developed the neighborhood years ago, but held on to certain parcels of land, including the main street running through the community. If he's willing to sell, you could own the very road the HOA depends on. Jake felt a slow grin forming. And if I own the road, what happens? Well, Maggie said, technically, you could charge the HOA rent for using it. You could impose your own rules. If they don't pay up, you could restrict access, maybe even shut down that precious clubhouse. Jake didn't need to hear another word. Within an hour, he was sitting in a small diner across from Frank Holloway, a grizzled old man who looked like he had seen every scam and scheme in the book. He sipped his coffee while Jake explained what was happening, nodding occasionally but saying nothing. When Jake finally finished, Frank let out a dry chuckle. Those HOA fools still causing problems, Frank muttered. They try to find me once over my mailbox being an inch too high. A mailbox, for God's sake. So you see why I want to buy the land. Jake said, if I own it, I can shut them down. Frank tapped his fingers on the table, considering. I like your style, kid. Tell you what, give me a fair price and the land is yours. Jake wasted no time finalizing the deal. By the end of the day, he officially owned the road running through Oak Estates, the land under the HOA's office, and the parking lot of their beloved clubhouse. And the best part? The HOA had no idea. That evening, he sat back in his chair, sipping a beer as he stared at the fine notice one last time. Karen and her HOA goons thought they had power. They thought they controlled him. But by the time they realized what had happened, it would be too late. They had picked a fight with the wrong man. For now, he wouldn't say a word. He would let them think they had won, let them continue their little power games, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet no longer belonged to them. The moment they came knocking again, demanding their money, he would drop the hammer. As he took another sip, he couldn't help but laugh. They wanted to fine him for his driveway? Fine. But soon enough, they would be paying him just to step onto their own street. Jake woke up the next morning with a sense of satisfaction he hadn't felt in weeks. He had done it. He had turned the tables on the HOA without them even realizing it. Owning the land beneath that precious community meant that he was now in control, and all he had to do was wait for the perfect moment to reveal it. He knew Karen and her board wouldn't stop their harassment. They were too smug, too convinced of their power. They were going to push him again, and when they did, he would be ready. It didn't take long. That afternoon, another letter from the HOA arrived, slid neatly under his door like a passive-aggressive dagger. Jake opened it with an amused smirk, already guessing what it contained. Sure enough, it was another warning, this time stating that his fine had increased due to noncompliance. The letter threatened immediate legal action if he didn't pay within 7 days. They were escalating, trying to scare him into submission. It was almost funny, almost. Instead of reacting, he took a slow walk outside, letting his eyes scan the neighborhood. The street was quiet, but he could see the usual HOA enforcers lurking, watching. A few houses down, an older man named Mr. Thompson was getting an earful from a board member about his front lawn being too dry. Across the street, a young couple whispered nervously as another HOA officer took photos of their flower pots. It was a community built on fear, and Karen was the queen of it all. Jake took a deep breath, knowing it was time to start his counterattack. He called Maggie and asked her to prepare a legal notice. If the HOA wanted to play hardball, then so would he. The next day, he walked straight into the HOA office with a sealed envelope and dropped it on Karen's desk. She barely looked up from her computer, clicking away as if he was beneath her attention. "Mr. Carter," she said with a sigh, "unless you're here to pay your fine, I don't see why you're wasting my time." Jake leaned on the desk, making sure she had a look at him. "Oh, I'm here for something much better than that." Karen finally glanced at the envelope, frowning. "What is this?" "Just a little legal update," Jake said, barely containing his grin. "Something I thought you should see before you make any more threats." She opened the envelope, skimming the contents. At first, her expression remained cold and indifferent, but then her eyes widened, her posture stiffened, and for the first time, she looked uncertain. This isn't possible," she muttered, flipping the pages as if she could somehow will them to change. Jake crossed his arms, enjoying the moment. "Oh, it's very possible. In fact, it's already done. As of last week, I became the legal owner of the road running through this neighborhood. That includes the land under this office, the parking lot, and, well, your entire headquarters." Karen's hands trembled slightly as she set the papers down, her lips pressed together in a tight line. Jake could see the gears turning in her head. She was scrambling, trying to find a way out, some loophole, but there wasn't one. He had played her game and beaten her at it. "You can't just—" "Oh, but I can," Jake interrupted smoothly, and I did. "And here's the fun part, Karen. Since I own the road, I can now legally charge the HOA for using it. You know, like a toll. And if you refuse to pay, well, I guess I could always close it off. Maybe put up a gate. No cars in, no cars out. That includes emergency vehicles, by the way. I'm sure the city would love to hear about that." Karen shot up from her chair, her face red with fury. "This is extortion." "No," Jake said, shrugging. "This is business. The same way you fine people for their grass being half an inch too high. I'm charging you for using my property. Fair is fair, right?" The board members behind Karen were whispering among themselves, their smug confidence quickly crumbling. One of them, a man with a thin mustache and an even thinner spine, cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, perhaps we can come to some kind of agreement?" Jake raised a hand. "Oh, don't worry. I'm more than reasonable. I'll give you all 1 week to prepare. After that, the HOA will owe me monthly payments for street usage, office space rental, and of course, penalties for all the harassment you've been handing out." Karen's hands clenched into fists. "You're bluffing. The HOA won't stand for this." Jake smiled. "Then take me to court." "Oh, wait. You can't because I own the land. And if you refuse to cooperate, well, I can always start enforcing my own rules. Maybe I'll start fining board members for, I don't know, existing." Karen looked like she was going to explode. The other board members exchanged nervous glances, realizing just how deep in trouble they were. The power shift was undeniable. The HOA had bullied the wrong man, and now they were backed into a corner with no way out. Jake turned to leave, pausing at the door just long enough to add, "Oh, and by the way, tell your enforcement officers to stay off my property unless they want to start paying me for trespassing." As he walked out of the building, he could hear the board members breaking in a frantic discussion, their voices a mixture of panic and desperation. He had them exactly where he wanted them. The HOA had spent years terrorizing homeowners, making them feel powerless. But now the balance had shifted, and Jake had every intention of making them feel what it was like to be at the mercy of someone else's rules. By the time he reached his house, his phone buzzed with a message from Maggie. It was short and simple, but it brought an even bigger smile to his face. "HOA board just scheduled an emergency meeting. You rattle them. They know they screwed up." Jake leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms behind his head. This was just the beginning. The real fun was yet to come. The morning after his confrontation with Karen and the HOA board, Jake sat on his front porch with a fresh cup of coffee, watching the neighborhood wake up. A few residents walked their dogs, a couple of joggers passed by, and the usual HOA enforcers skulked around, pretending to inspect properties while keeping a close eye on him. He could practically feel the panic rippling through the HOA's ranks. They weren't used to being challenged, let alone by someone who had just outmaneuvered them in their own game. Now, they were scrambling, trying to figure out what to do next. Jake had already won, but he wasn't about to let them off easy. It was time to make them feel the weight of their own rules. Later that day, an email from the HOA landed in his inbox. It was written in the usual overly formal tone, attempting to act as if everything was business as usual. They were requesting a meeting with him to discuss terms regarding his ownership of the streets and HOA facilities. He couldn't help but laugh. A week ago, they were threatening to take his house away. Now, they wanted to negotiate. He replied with a simple message confirming his attendance. It was time to see just how desperate they had become. When he arrived at the HOA's office, the tension was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. Karen sat at the center of the long meeting table, her usual air of superiority shaken but not entirely gone. The other board members looked equally uncomfortable, their confidence eroded by the sheer fact that they had no leverage anymore. Jake took his seat without saying a word, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them squirm. Karen cleared her throat, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "Mr. Kara, we appreciate you taking the time to meet with us today." Jake raised an eyebrow. "I'm sure you do." Forced a tight smile, "We understand there may have been misunderstandings between us, but surely we can come to a resolution that benefits both parties." Jake leaned back in his chair. "Oh, I'm all for that. See, you've spent years enforcing ridiculous rules on this neighborhood. You fine people for things that don't matter, threaten them with legal action, and act like you own this place. But now, well, I own this place, so I think it's only fair that we start playing by some new rules." The board members exchanged nervous glances. One of them, a balding man with thick glasses, cleared his throat. "And what exactly are these new rules?" Jake pulled out a sheet of paper and placed it on the table. "First, The HOA will now be paying rent for the land your office and clubhouse sit on. Failure to make payments will result in immediate eviction. Second, I'll be implementing new community regulations. That means no more absurd fines over nonsense like mailbox colors, flower arrangements, or the shade of someone's driveway. Karen's expression twisted with anger. You can't just rewrite the rules of this neighborhood. Jake smirked. Oh, but I can. Because the HOA only has power over property owned by homeowners, and since I own the street and the common areas, that gives me the authority to regulate those spaces. If you want to keep your little organization running, you're going to play by my rules now. The room fell into stunned silence. They had no counter-arguments, no threats left to make. They had spent years bullying people under the illusion of authority, but now that illusion had shattered. Karen's voice dropped to a low, controlled tone. If you do this, you'll destroy everything the HOA has built. Jake shrugged. Good. The meeting ended without any official agreements, but Jake knew he had already won. Over the next few days, word spread through the neighborhood that the HOA's reign of terror was coming to an end. Homeowners who had once lived in fear began to realize they no longer had to tolerate Karen's ridiculous rules. Some even started to openly defy old HOA regulations, repainting their houses in unapproved colors, installing basketball hoops in their driveways, and planting whatever flowers they pleased without worrying about fines. Jake didn't stop there. He made sure the HOA felt the consequences of its years of extortion. He sent official invoices to the board demanding payment for their use of his property. When they tried to ignore him, he sent another notice, this time with a late fee attached. If they wanted to play the fine game, they were going to learn how it felt to be on the receiving end. Karen, desperate to regain control, attempted to rally support from the neighborhood, sending out emails warning that Jake's actions would lead to community deterioration. But her efforts backfired. The residents were tired of her tactics. They had seen firsthand how little the HOA actually did for them, besides micromanaging their lives and draining their wallets. People started ignoring Karen's emails, refusing to attend HOA meetings, and even openly mocking the board's desperation. Then came the final blow. An independent audit revealed that the HOA had been mismanaging funds for years, spending excessive amounts on unnecessary office renovations and board member perks instead of actual community improvements. The discovery sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, further dismantling what little credibility the HOA had left. With no way to recover, Karen and the remaining board members resigned in disgrace. One by one, their offices emptied out and their influence evaporated. The HOA, once feared and untouchable, had collapsed under its own corruption. Jake stood on his driveway, watching as Karen packed up her belongings from the now abandoned HOA office. She looked over at him, her face a mixture of anger and humiliation. He gave her a small wave and a knowing smirk. She didn't say a word. She just climbed in her car and drove away. The neighborhood changed overnight. With the HOA gone, people were finally free to enjoy their homes without fear. Neighbors who had barely spoken before started talking again, relieved that the dictatorship was over. Jake sat back, beer in hand, enjoying the view of his perfectly ordinary driveway, the same one that had started this entire war. He had come to this neighborhood looking for peace and quiet. Instead, he had found a battle. But in the end, he had done what no one else had ever dared to do. He had beaten the HOA at their own game. And now, for the first time since he had moved in, Oak Ridge Estates finally felt like home. Jake woke up to a different neighborhood. The air felt lighter, the atmosphere less suffocating, and for the first time since moving in, he could step outside without seeing someone measuring grass length or taking notes on mailbox heights. The HOA was gone, and with it, the unnecessary rules that had plagued the homeowners for years. It was strange how quickly things changed. Neighbors who once tiptoed around in fear of fines were now openly chatting on sidewalks. Kids were riding their bikes without being scolded about safety violations, and the once overly pristine neighborhood was starting to feel real. People were finally enjoying their homes the way they were meant to. Jake took a sip of his coffee as he leaned against his truck, watching a group of homeowners gather in front of the now empty HOA office. The doors were shut, the once intimidating sign removed, and the parking lot, which had been reserved for board members only, was now a community space. A few residents had taken it upon themselves to put out picnic tables, and someone even suggested converting the space into a small park. It was a refreshing sight. Without the HOA breathing down their necks, people were working together instead of against each other. Later that afternoon, he received a call from Maggie. She had been following the aftermath closely, amused by how quickly the power structure had crumbled. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You're officially a legend," she said, chuckling. "The HOA is in shambles. Karen is gone, and the neighborhood loves you. What's next?" Jake thought about it for a moment. He hadn't planned much beyond dismantling the HOA. His entire mission had been to get rid of their absurd rules and free himself and his neighbors from their grip. But now that the dust had settled, he realized something. The HOA had been the problem, but that didn't mean the neighborhood should fall into complete disorder. If he wasn't careful, someone new would come in, pick up the pieces, and create an even worse version of what had just been destroyed. "I think it's time for something new," he finally said. "No, HOA, but we still need some way to manage things. Something fair. Something run by the people who actually live here, not a bunch of power-hungry control freaks." Maggie hummed in agreement. "A community association, maybe? Nothing binding, just something to keep things organized without the ridiculous fines and nonsense." Jake nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Exactly. No more abusing power. No more stupid rules about driveway shades. Just common-sense decisions that actually help people." Within the next few days, he put the idea into motion. He called a meeting at the old HOA clubhouse, now a free space for the community to use. Word spread quickly, and before he knew it, nearly the entire neighborhood showed up. The energy was different. No more people sitting stiffly in rows, afraid to speak. This time they talked, they laughed, and most importantly, they had ideas. Jake stood at the front of the room, leaning casually against the table that once belonged to the HOA board. He let the chatter settle before speaking. "Well, I think it's safe to say none of us are going to miss the old HOA," he started, earning a round of laughter and agreement from the crowd. "But just because they're gone doesn't mean we should let this place fall apart. We all live here, and if we want to keep this neighborhood great, we need to work together." A woman in the crowd raised her hand. "Are you suggesting we create another HOA?" Jake shook his head immediately. "Absolutely not. No fines, no secret board meetings, no Karens sitting on a throne telling people what they can and can't do. I'm talking about something different, community association, voluntary, transparent, and only focused on things that actually matter. We talk, we vote, and we make sure this place works for everyone. No more petty rules, just common sense." A murmur of approval spread through the crowd. People liked the idea of structure without oppression. Someone suggested setting up a simple online group where residents could discuss neighborhood issues. Another proposed a monthly gathering to keep things organized. It was all coming together, and it was clear that people were relieved to have a say in their own community again. As the meeting wrapped up, Jake felt a sense of satisfaction settle over him. He had done what he set out to do, but more than that, he had helped build something better. The HOA had tried to control people through fear. Now those same people were taking control of their own neighborhood, and they were doing it the right way. A few days later, as Jake sat on his front porch, he spotted a familiar car creeping down the street. It was Karen. She had been gone for weeks, but now here she was, driving through slowly as if hoping no one would notice her. But Jake noticed. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she glanced at the houses with a mixture of bitterness and disbelief. Her power was gone, and she knew it. As she pulled up in front of his house, he remained seated, sipping his coffee. She rolled down the window, but didn't say anything at first. Her eyes scanned the neighborhood, taking in the kids playing, the relaxed atmosphere, the way people actually looked happy. It was the complete opposite of what she had tried to maintain. Finally, she spoke. "You think this is an improvement?" Jake set his coffee down. "I don't think so." She scoffed, shaking her head. "They'll regret this. Give it time. Without structure, places like this fall apart." Jake let out a small laugh. The only thing falling apart around here was you and your little empire. People don't need someone like you telling them how to live. They're doing just fine on their own. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. She wanted to argue, wanted to say something to regain a shred of control, but there was nothing left for her here. She had lost. Without another word, she rolled up her window and drove off. Jake watched her go, knowing she wouldn't be back. The neighborhood had changed for the better. There were no more pointless fines, no more letters threatening legal action, no more fear. People had taken their homes back, and Jake had gotten exactly what he wanted, peace and quiet on his own terms.